Today, I want to talk about Will Bettelheim from You Season 2 and why his eventual release from the cage isn't proof that Joe can change, but a controlled outcome to make it look like he has. In the wake of his self-defense murder of Jasper and the accidental killing of Henderson, Joe returns to the storage unit where he has the real Will held hostage and decides to let him go free. Joe frames this as growth and evidence that he's different now, and later he calls on Will to reaffirm that version of himself. But the decision to release him isn't as selfless as it seems. Joe convinces his captive that he is always trying to do the right thing, but his behavior implies something different. He's not worried about being good, his concern is controlling the narrative to make somebody believe that he is. So why did Joe cage Will instead of just killing him? Why does Will remain loyal to Joe years later, ready to help whenever he calls? And what does Joe's test of Will actually reveal about his need for control and his inability to commit to real change? Let's talk about it. After the first season ends with the return of Joe's last girlfriend, the next season starts with the forecast of her death and Joe's second chance at love when he sets his sights on Love Quinn. But by the end of the episode, Joe returns to a storage unit where he has a man locked in a cage, revealing his new narrative trick for the season, withholding key information to create a deceptive illusion. Back in New York, Candace returned after recognizing the story in Beck's book and speaks to the suggestion of a pattern. Joe rejects her accusations, refusing to acknowledge that his murder of Beck defines anything about his true character. Then he proceeds to run to LA, lock onto a new woman, and attack a man in an alley, trapping him in the cage as a proxy. Joe engages in the same behavior as Season 1, but it just gets framed differently. Season 2 removes Joe's premeditated intent to appear as if he's reacting impulsively, so he can later claim plausible deniability and passionately defend that he wanted the scene to play out differently.
I didn't think. I acted. It was an emergency.
This time around, Joe omits his underlying motivation in an attempt to discourage scrutiny. Joe proudly shared his plot to lure Benji into the basement. It wasn't kept a secret because Joe narratively justified the trap ahead of time. But there's no way to justify kidnapping Will in the moment. It's self-serving and Joe knows it, so he just leaves that part out, until something forces his hand and Joe reveals what he must to maintain narrative control. By that point, though, he's already been priming the story to lessen the impact and finds a way to justify his violence after the fact. It's only after Jasper arrives and a message is relayed through Ellie that Joe fills us in on what he's been doing with Will. Oh, you've had a man in a cage this whole time? Interesting. It does beg the question, if Jasper never showed up in search of Will, would Joe have ever revealed his existence? He's internally obscuring his intent until he's compelled to confront them by an external force, and then he weaponizes a belief in love to justify his actions by their idealized results. So probably not. With the help of Will's compliance in the cage, Joe refines the process of manipulating perception by performing his character for a captive audience. For Joe, Will is a fresh start and a blank slate to dictate reality and force a different outcome as proof of concept that he's changed, but he only wins because he rigged the game. Will is the perfect subject for Joe's test because he submits to Joe's narration without deeper interrogation. He has no preconceived notions about Joe, no knowledge of his past, and no emotional entanglement. Will only knows Joe from how he presents himself, which is exactly how Joe wants to be understood.
Listen to me closely. If you don't quit and help me, I will know you are a bad person. And I have no trouble doing bad things to bad people.
So he consults Will as an external conscience to work out the kinks in his framing. When faced with a reality that's unfavorable, Joe enlists the help of Will to process it into something more palatable. He dismisses Joe's killing of Jasper as his own hallucination and affirms that confronting Henderson is somehow letting justice run its course. He accepts Joe's good intentions at face value because Joe's side of the story is his only source of context. Joe's discussions and debates with Will aren't a demonstration of self-reflection but a performance to validate himself, and by the end, they're a successful test of his narrative control. But Joe has just externalized the scene of doing things differently when he's failed that task by virtue of the dilemma in the first place. He's locked a man in a cage. That's a crime. That's bad. End of story. Joe's conflict and decision over letting Will go is never as real as it seems. He was able to attack Will because he's an easy target, a criminal himself who offers uncritical acceptance of Joe's self-justification and validates his fraudulent identity. So what risk does Will really pose to Joe? What does letting Will go prove about Joe when it requires no sacrifice or accountability?
You do bad things when you feel trapped, or key, to protect someone. To me, that makes you more good than bad. I think you're a good man.
Nobody else even knows about Will. Joe is proving he's changed only to himself. But Will was a layup, an easy score for Joe to manufacture a moral win to make up for murdering Beck. And it worked. Through sheer brute force of will, Joe convinces his captive that the ends justify the means. He constructs the scenario where he gets to make the right choice to disprove the rule of his pattern. But mind you, this is right after he throws Henderson down the stairs.
I knew you'd do the right thing.
But as safe as it is, and always was, to let Will out, the decision is not an indication of change. And you know how I know? Because Candace is back on the case. With the real Will gone, Joe turns to Love for affirmation until Candace exposes him and derails his new life as Will Bettelheim. He mopes around while Love pretends to move on with Milo, trying to bait Joe to kill him like Benji, but that boy is too big, and Joe is still clinging to the character of the man who let Will go free. He starts hooking up with Delilah, but she can see that he's damaged, and that's not the way that Joe wants to be perceived. When she learns of the murder that Will never did, Joe attacks and locks her in the cage. He creates a plan to let her go, but reconciles with Love, which narratively guarantees Delilah's death, even if Joe doesn't want to acknowledge the decision's inevitable consequence. When he discovers Delilah's dead body, appearing to serve as confirmation of his violent pattern, Joe instinctively calls Will to absolve himself. He fills him in on the situation, barely, vaguely, and in a way that forefronts his optimistic intentions to deny responsibility for Delilah's death. Will enables him to believe that he can maintain control of the scene if he just finds the right framing.
Will, it wasn't me. I mean, I don't know that because I was on a lot of drugs. I really feel like I would not have done this.
I believe you.
Of course, Consequence Candace catches him again and tries to expose him to Love Quinn. But when Joe accepts that he killed Delilah, he manages to reconcile his exposure with the need to avoid accountability by making a last-ditch effort offering Love radical, it hurts to even say it, honesty. At the moment, he's just trying to save face, but it works a little too well, weaponizing Love like that, because she turns around and kills Candace. When Love returns, guilty of the same violence that Joe just confessed to moments ago, he recognizes that committing murder means she's crazy. So Joe channels the experience of Beck and lures Love into the cage, staring into her eyes while holding a weapon behind his back. Pause. Everything this season, kidnapping Will, protecting Ellie, caging Delilah, it was all in pursuit of Love, and now that she has broken the illusion, Joe immediately resorts to killing her. One, that's crazy because he could just shove her and lock her in the cage and call the police if he was really trying to move on from committing murder. But two, then what was it all for? How is it okay to kidnap Will, to be with a woman, and then turn around and murder that woman that you kidnapped for? Just don't think about it too much. Joe doesn't kill Love at the moment, he spares her because she's pregnant and she's allowed to stick around for another season. But he doesn't reconnect with Will, anchoring his fairy tale belief in the delusion of having the perfect family and protecting his daughter. When the baby turns out to be a boy, just by the act of being born, Henry has subverted the idealized narrative of his father. So Joe abandons his son in Madre Linda, like letting Henry go proves that he can make sacrifices for someone else's benefit. And then he utilizes fake passports that Will left behind to embark on his insanely romantic search for Marianne. While his delusional antics in London leave him unable to utter his son's name, when Joe returns to New York, he simply picks him up again. So, is it still a sacrifice? When Will returns in the finale, it's not only convenient to the plot, but a signal that Joe is in need of reinforcement, and it demonstrates how Will only exists to Joe when his ego is in crisis and the stories he tells himself are falling apart. As Joe runs away from New York in a desperate attempt to avoid accountability, wait, didn't he already do that? He reloads the lie of believing that he can be saved by Love and reaches out to Will for assistance.
Hey, Will, it's me.
Hey, buddy.
How's it going?
Starting to feel like a favor dispenser here.
He tries to channel the version of himself who was able to escape consequence by maintaining narrative control, but in doing so, Joe has forgotten that getting exactly what he wants can be the most perfect punishment of all. He employs Will to connect him with his son, relying on his innocence to reaffirm Joe's faith in himself. But Henry doesn't validate his father, he calls him out as a monster, and Will disappears just as quick as he came back. Yeah, I think if I was Will, I wouldn't show my face after that either. The kid figured it out, but you didn't? That's sad. So in summary, why did Joe cage Will? To steal his identity. That's it. Joe saw a pretty woman and wanted to stalk her, so he attacked a mentally ill man in an alley and locked him in a cage to steal his name because it was inconvenient to kill him at the time, because of the implications. Aw, how nice and merciful of Joe to let Will out of the cage, that he trapped him in the first place.